So today what we're going to look at is Chapter 1 of the David Myers 8th edition Psychology AP textbook. So we're looking at thinking critically with psychological science. So what we're looking at is just an outline of what Chapter 1 is talking about. So when we look at psychology, over the years, psychology has kind of been trying to answer like people's curiosity about the world. And people have all kinds of different views on what psychology is and what it should do. So we look at intuition and we look at common sense. Intuition is your gut feeling, and common sense is things that should be pretty common to most people. So these things help us in asking questions, but they're never free of actual errors. So when we look at our gut feeling, you might actually think that you've hired a really good employee because your gut feeling was that this person would be a team player, it would be a real good person to go ahead and add to the team. And that's your intuition. However, like when you actually hire the person, they turn out to be the worst employee ever. And if you look at this, try this. Most people would just go ahead and try and times it, and they think that they would actually be able to get it. But this is an error of common sense. So hindsight bias is the simple thing that, like, I knew it all along. And what it means with I knew it all along is that after you actually know the answer to something or you know what has occurred, people are like, oh, well, you should have known that all along. Well, after learning the outcome of an event, it's easy to have 20/20 vision. So when like the housing market collapsed, people were like, oh, you should have known that that was going to happen. Well, if you knew that something like that was going to happen, you should have told everybody else. So overconfidence is sometimes we think we know more than we actually know. So if I give you these anagrams, how long do you think it'll take you to unscramble? Now, if I give you the answers, it's going to be a lot easier, right? If I give you the answers, most people actually say it take them about 10 seconds. However, it took most people on average about 3 minutes to actually unscramble those anagrams. So when we look at psychological science, we look at trying to sort out opinions and examine conclusions. Then we look at like how people think, how they feel, and how they act. Remember, in psychology, we look at the biopsychosocial viewpoint. So when we look at the scientific attitude, we look at curiosity. We are a very curious group of people. We like to explore our environment. We like to explore why things occur the way they do. And we are skeptical. We do doubt and we question things. And we have humility. This is the ability to accept responsibility when we're wrong. This is a hard one, because humility means that you were absolutely wrong. Now, critical thinking means that you do not accept things based on blind faith. Critical thinking is you actually delve into arguments, you look at assumptions, you look at research, you try and figure out what is actually going on. So in critical thinking, there's some sort of research, some sort of questioning of items. And the scientific method, which you need to know for the AP Psych exam, psychologists are like scientists, and they use the scientific method to come up with theories, how to organize, how to summarize people's behaviors. So when we look at theories, theories are just things that predict a behavior or event. It's a theory, it doesn't mean it's a fact. So a theory is low self-esteem contributes to depression. Now, when we look at hypothesis is a testable prediction. So when you look at hypothesis in psychology, you need to look at an if-then statement. If this occurs, then this is what's going to occur next. So if-then statement. So if people have low self-esteem, then they will feel depressed. Okay, so that's the if-then statement. Make sure you just, if you have to write a hypothesis, that you write it in an if-then statement. It lets your reader know this is what you are actually trying to test. Here is your prediction. So when we look at research, what we look at is our ability to test our actual experiment. And so individuals who score low on a self-esteem test and high on a depression test, that would actually confirm our hypothesis. So here's the research process. We got a theory, we've done some sort of observation, we come up with a theory, now we've got a hypothesis, the if-then statement, and then we do some sort of action research. Some sort of research. It could be observations, it could just be, in general, a scientific method kind of experiment to figure out whether this actually is true. Case studies is in which you study one person in an in-depth manner, and when you study that one person in an in-depth manner, what you're hoping to do is come up with universal behavioral principles. So case studies are great in medical experiments, and then we look at clinical case studies. So clinical studies is like what Sigmund Freud used, and this is where you normally study someone who has a problem and you're trying to find like the cause of the problem. So clinical studies, this is what Freud did. This is why people have a hard time lag with some of Freud's theories is because he uses clinical research, clinical studies, case studies, and all of his experiments. So surveys are just those self-reporting little pieces of paper that everybody has. You fill out phone surveys, and what a survey does is it asks you your opinion, your attitude, your behavior, and it's self-reported, which means people can't lie. If people feel that a survey result isn't going to actually be confidential, people are less likely to actually answer truthfully. So if I ask teenagers how many times a week do they drink alcohol, and they're teenagers, so they're underage, you know, if a student feels that I'm not going to be confidential about the material, that I'm going to go to their parents and say, look at what your child is doing, then people are not going to answer the questions truthfully. But in a survey, what you should do is you should have yes, no, true, false, 1 to 10. They should be very clear-cut answers, and wording actually needs to be very much considered in a survey. So wording can change the results of a survey. So should cigarettes, ads, and pornography be allowed on television? So not allowed versus forbidden is kind of different. So should cigarette ads and pornography be allowed on television? How about should cigarette ads and pornography not be allowed on television? Should cigarette ads and pornography be forbidden on television? That wording effect can change how people affect things. So false consensus effect just means that you believe everybody else actually shares your belief in your behavior. So it's the tendency to overestimate. Everybody thought this in that class. Everybody thinks Miss Davis is crazy. You know, that's that false consensus effect. Now, random sampling, this is when every member of the population has an equal chance of being included in the actual sample. So if you're wanting to look at high school students in a particular county, you're going to want to pick all the different schools in the county and try and get a fair representation of the population. And so if a survey is not a random sampling, then it's not a valid survey. So naturalistic observation is when you study the beast in their nature. So naturalistic observation, you do not intervene, you do not interfere at all in the environment. So if you wanted to look at kids and you wanted to look at their behavior in the lunchroom, you would go silently into the lunchroom, watch every kid's behavior, write down notes, never question, never intervene. If you are questioning and you're intervening, then that is not naturalistic observation. So summary, when we're looking at descriptive methods, you can do case studies, you can do surveys, you can do naturalistic observation. All these things would describe behavior. Now we look at correlation. Correlation just suggests that there are two things that correlate, that might accompany each other. So we look at correlation coefficiency. So correlation coefficiency is just a statistical measure of the relationship between two variables. It can be positive, it can be negative. Now, if there is, you know, a strong relationship, it could be good. If there's a weak relationship, that, you know, it might mean that your results are a little bit different. How you tell whether there's a correlation or not is through a scatter plot. And a scatter plot just suggests the strength of the relationship. So when you look at this chart right here, there's obviously no relationship here on that scatter chart because the plots are all over. Whereas here, there's a perfect negative correlation. So what you need to look at when you look at coefficiencies, when you're looking at a correlation, it suggests that there's a possible relationship. It does not mean that there is a cause and effect. So when you look at this height and temperament, you know, like everybody thinks short people are mean. So in this, when we actually look, there does seem to be a moderate positive correlation between height and temper. Now what you need to do then, since there shows that there's a positive correlation, that doesn't mean go tell all the short people that they need to be nice and eat their spoonful of sugar and all that. What you need to start doing is start doing another research method. Figure out, you know, do a case study of some of these short people. So correlation and causation. So low self-esteem could cause depression. Depression could cause low self-esteem. Distressing events or biological predispositions could cause low self-esteem and depression. So there's just a suggestibility that there's a relationship, and you got to do more research to see whether it actually is a cause and effect relationship. So remember Grandma and her creaky old knees. So Grandma's like, oh, it's going to rain, I can feel it in my bones. Well, if Grandma's saying she can feel it in her bones, Grandma's probably watched the news. Or she's looked outside the window and saw that the clouds are there and they are a little bit dark. that is an illusionary correlation. So there's no real relationship there. People just think that there is. It's like the parents who conceive right after after they adopted. You've been trying for over a year to actually conceive a child. So you've been throwing every dart you can at the dartboard. Eventually, you're gonna hit the dartboard, and so you just happen to conceive right after actually getting approved for an adoption. We like to perceive order in random events. We're human beings, and we like to look for order and meaningful. So people who like to look at conspiracy theories and Nostradamus, these are people who like to see order in random events. Oh, that's smoke, that appears like this image. That's just you trying to make something there. Now, if you look at these two people, they won the lottery. They won the California lottery on the same day. Now, that doesn't mean that because you and your spouse go to different, 7-Eleven and buy a lottery ticket that you're going to both win on the lottery. If you look at this last lottery, a lot of teachers won. So obviously teachers are more likely to win the lottery. Well, that's not true. Maybe more teachers play the lottery. Maybe more teachers are going into these big work pools. Who knows? Maybe teachers are more desperate to get a pay raise, and maybe they only see the lottery as their way to get a pay raise. So exploring cause and effect. So like other sciences, experimentation is the backbone of the psychological research. So experiments isolate cause and their effect. So you need to know how to set up a scientific experiment. You need to know control. You need to know how to manipulate. So when we manipulate things, we're messing with them. And then when we control, we're going to compare off that group. So when we look at the independent variable is what we're manipulating. This is something that you're trying to look at the effect of. So for example, when examining the effects of breastfeeding upon intelligence, breastfeeding is the independent variable. Now, here's what I always tell you guys. If you're having a hard time figuring out the independent versus the dependent variable, look at the number. If there's a number, that will be your dependent variable. So the dependent variable in this is going to be intelligence because I can measure intelligence. A dependent variable is a measurable variable. It's something that you can test, you can observe, there's a number associated with it. Whereas when you look at the independent variable, this is what you're manipulating. You're manipulating breastfeeding. So for kids who are actually breastfed, they tend to be smarter than the kids who are not breastfed by mommy. So a dependent variable is a factor that may change in response to an independent variable. So in psychology, it's normally a behavior or a mental process. So in our example, the dependent variable was intelligence because I could measure it, I could test it. Whereas the independent variable was the effect of breastfeeding. So this is what you're kind of looking at in an independent and dependent variable. Now, a double-blind experiment is when the experimenters and the actual people participating in the experiment do not know which group they're in. Are they in the treatment group or are they in the control group? The treatment group is the group who actually gets the real medicine or actually gets the treatment. The control group is the group who gets the placebo. If you are doing a medical research study with a drug, you must do a double-blind procedure. Because if you don't, your experimenters who have been working on this since their natural born life, they might manipulate the data to favor them. So in a true double-blind experiment, the participants and the actual experimenters do not know who actually received the treatment and who actually received the placebo in the groups. They don't know, and they don't know until after they've analyzed all their data. This tries to eliminate any pre-existing biasness between the experimenters and the patients. Some patients are going to report that they actually experimented some relief or whatever the pill is supposed to do because they feel bad for the experimenter or they like the experimenter. Random assignment is trying to eliminate these pre-existing differences between the groups. So you go A, B, A, B, A, B, A, B, and you do it like that because what you're trying to do is you're trying to get your groups to be as good as you can without having any biasness within the group. So you can't help. Sometimes things happen like these confounding variables, like someone had a heart disorder that they didn't tell you about. But remember, you're supposed to pre-screen and then you're supposed to actually go ahead and randomly assign them. So when you look at this, this is a summary of steps during experimentation. You have your condition, that's your experiment, and then you're going to have your control group, so you have your experimental and control group. Your experimental group should do the breast milk. Your control group is going to do formula because that's what you're basing it off. Your dependent variable is what you're measuring, so you're going to measure their intelligence scores. So we're going to stop here, and then we're going to move on to part 2 of chapter 1.